Flight 447 lost both engines at 30,000 feet. 247 passengers. Nowhere to land for 200 miles. Pilot declaring Mayday, flight attendants panicking, oxygen masks dropping. But in seat 14C, retired mechanic Jim Walsh stayed calm. He approached the cockpit and said, "Sir, I can help." The pilot snapped, "We don't need passenger advice right now." Jim replied quietly, "I used to fix Apache helicopters under fire in Afghanistan. I've seen this problem before." What happened next saved 247 lives. Welcome to Unsung Heroes Stories. Before we dive into this death-defying rescue at 30,000 feet, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe heroes come in unexpected forms, hit that subscribe button. This story will change how you see your fellow passengers. United Flight 447, Chicago O'Hare to Denver International. Tuesday morning, 11:47 a.m. Boeing 737-800, fully loaded with business travelers, families heading to Colorado for spring break, and Jim Walsh in seat 14C. Jim was heading to Denver for his daughter's wedding. At 58, he'd been retired from the Army for 3 years and was still adjusting to civilian life. 20 years as a helicopter maintenance chief had left him with habits most people didn't notice, constantly scanning for mechanical issues, listening to engine sounds, automatically assessing vehicle performance. The flight started normal. Smooth takeoff, clear skies, captain announcing cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Jim was reading a maintenance manual. Old habits die hard, when he felt something in the engine vibration that didn't sound right. At exactly 30,000 feet, 200 miles from Denver, everything went wrong at once. First engine failure at 11:58 a.m. The plane lurched to the left, passengers gasped, flight attendants grabbed handholds. Captain's voice over intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced an engine malfunction. We're adjusting course to Denver. Please remain calm." Jim knew better. That wasn't just engine malfunction, that was complete engine failure. And the vibration he'd been feeling suggested the second engine was about to follow. 90 seconds later, it did. Total engine failure at 30,000 feet. Both turbofans dead. Plane, now a 180,000-pound glider with 247 souls on board and nowhere to land for 200 miles. The Boeing 737 began its inevitable descent. Without engine power, they had maybe 15 minutes before they'd be forced to attempt an emergency landing wherever they could find open ground. Passengers were screaming. Flight attendants were trying to maintain order while following emergency protocols. Oxygen masks deployed. Emergency lighting activated. The captain's voice strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost both engines. We're declaring an emergency and looking for the nearest available landing site." Jim Walsh unbuckled his seatbelt and started walking toward the cockpit. The lead flight attendant, Nancy, tried to stop him. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately." "Ma'am, I'm a helicopter mechanic. 20 years Army aviation. I need to talk to your pilots. Before we continue, imagine you're on that plane. Would you trust a passenger who claimed he could help? Or would you want him to stay in his seat? Let us know in the comments." Nancy hesitated. In 20 years of flying, she'd never had a passenger request cockpit access during an emergency. But something about Jim's calm demeanor and specific knowledge made her reconsider. "What kind of helicopter mechanic?" "Apache longbow, combat maintenance chief, Afghanistan, 2 tours." Nancy made a decision that would save 247 lives. She led Jim to the cockpit door. Captain Mike Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years, but he'd never faced total engine failure. His training covered the scenario, but reality was more terrifying than any simulator. "We're at 28,000 feet and descending," Rodriguez told his co-pilot Sarah Chen. "Best glide speed is 280 knots. At this rate, we've got maybe 12 minutes before we have to put down wherever we can find space." That's when Nancy knocked on the cockpit door. "Captain, there's a passenger who says he can help." Military helicopter mechanic. Rodriguez's first instinct was to refuse. Cockpit access during emergency was against every protocol. But with 2 dead engines and 247 lives at stake, protocol seemed less important than any possible solution. "Send him in." Jim entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. Multiple warning lights, both engine indicators showing 0 thrust, hydraulic pressure dropping. But what caught his attention wasn't what was broken. It was what was still working. "Captain, what's your APU status?" Jim asked, referring to the auxiliary power unit. "A PU is running normally." Jim nodded. In Afghanistan, he'd kept damaged Apache helicopters flying by, maximizing whatever systems were still operational. This Boeing had more redundancies than most pilots realized. "Sir, I've seen this exact scenario with Apache helicopters. Different aircraft, same principle. You've got options you haven't considered yet." Rodriguez looked at Jim skeptically. "Such as?" "Ram air turbine deployment for hydraulic assist. And I think you can restart at least one engine if we descend to denser air." Jim Walsh had spent 20 years keeping Apache helicopters flying in impossible conditions. Afghanistan had taught him that aircraft could survive much more damage than most people believed, if you understood the systems. "Captain, what caused the engine failures?" "Looks like fuel system malfunction. Both engines starved simultaneously." Jim processed this information. In Afghanistan, he'd seen Apache helicopters lose fuel pressure due to combat damage, altitude changes, or system failures. The solution was often simpler than it appeared. "Sir, at this altitude, fuel atomization is different than at sea level. If you descend to 15,000 feet, fuel density increases. There's a chance you can restart one engine, maybe both." Co-pilot Chen looked doubtful. "We're trained to maintain altitude as long as possible to maximize glide distance." "Ma'am, with respect, helicopters don't glide. When we lost engines in combat, we descended immediately to restart in denser air. Different aircraft, same physics." Captain Rodriguez was running calculations. Standard procedure was to maintain altitude for maximum glide range, but they were still 180 miles from Denver, and at current descent rate, they'd be on the ground in 10 minutes whether they wanted to be or not. "How confident are you about this restart procedure?" Jim thought about the Apache helicopters he'd kept flying in Afghanistan, combat damage, fuel system failures, engine malfunctions. "Sir, I've done engine restarts on damaged aircraft under enemy fire. This Boeing has better systems than anything I worked on in the Army." Rodriguez made the decision. "Chen, initiate rapid descent to 15,000 feet. We're going to try this." The Boeing 737 dropped like a stone. Rapid descent from 25,000 to 15,000 feet in under 3 minutes. Passengers felt their ears pop. Some got airsick from the sudden altitude change. Jim stood behind the pilots watching engine indicators and system displays. At 15,000 feet, try fuel pump restart on engine 1 first. If fuel pressure normalizes, attempt engine start sequence. "This is completely outside normal procedures," Chen said. "Ma'am, normal procedures assume normal circumstances. We passed normal about 8 minutes ago." At 15,000 feet, Rodriguez initiated the restart sequence Jim had suggested. Fuel pump 1, engaged. Pressure building. Engine start sequence, initiated. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Engine indicators remained at 0. Jim watched the displays, remembering similar moments in Afghanistan when the difference between success and failure was measured in seconds. Then, ignition. Engine 1 sparked to life. "Holy shit," Rodriguez whispered, then caught himself. "Engine 1 is running. We have power." The Boeing 737 steadied, no longer in uncontrolled descent. One engine provided enough thrust to maintain altitude and controlled flight. "Try engine 2, Jim suggested. Rodriguez attempted the restart sequence on the second engine. This time, ignition came faster. Both engines running, all systems nominal. Flight 447 was no longer falling out of the sky. Denver Approach Control had been tracking Flight 447's emergency descent and was prepared for a crash landing. When Captain Rodriguez radioed that both engines were operational, there was stunned silence on the frequency. "United 447, confirm both engines restarted?" "Affirmative. Denver Approach." "Engines running normally, requesting vector for normal landing approach." The emergency vehicles that had been positioned for a crash landing stood down. What should have been a disaster had become a successful emergency restart at 15,000 feet. As the plane approached Denver International, passengers who had been praying for their lives were now asking what had happened. Why were they landing normally instead of crashing? Jim had returned to seat 14C and was reading his maintenance manual as if nothing had happened. Flight attendant Nancy approached him during final approach. "The captain wants to thank you personally after we land." "No need," Jim replied. "Just glad everyone's safe." "How did you know that would work?" Jim thought about the Apache helicopters he'd kept flying in Afghanistan, the Marines whose lives had depended on his ability to solve problems under pressure. You learn to improvise when people's lives depend on your decisions. Different aircraft, same principles. Flight 447 touched down at Denver International at 12:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour after takeoff from Chicago. All 247 passengers and crew walked off the plane safely. The FAA launched an immediate investigation into Flight 447's dual engine failure and subsequent restart. The preliminary report concluded that fuel system anomalies at high altitude had caused both engines to flame out, and that the restart procedure used was unconventional but effective. Captain Rodriguez personally thanked Jim Walsh and recommended him for civilian aviation recognition. "That man saved every life on this plane. We'd be having a very different conversation if he hadn't been in seat 14C. Jim deflected the attention. He'd come to Denver for his daughter's wedding, and that's what he wanted to focus on. But the story of Flight 447 had already begun spreading through aviation communities. Boeing engineers contacted Jim to understand the restart procedure he'd recommended. It turned out his combat experience with Apache helicopters had given him insights into engine restart procedures that commercial aviation hadn't fully explored. "We've been testing high-altitude restart procedures based on your recommendations," the Boeing engineer told him. "This could change emergency protocols for the entire 737 fleet." Jim's daughter Sarah was getting married the next day. At the rehearsal dinner, she introduced her father to the wedding guests. "My dad just saved 247 people on his flight here yesterday. He doesn't like talking about it, but I'm proud of him." The wedding guests applauded, but Jim was uncomfortable with the attention. In Afghanistan, saving lives had been part of the job. He didn't expect recognition for doing what needed to be done. 6 months later, Jim Walsh received a call from the FAA. They were developing new emergency procedures for commercial aviation based on lessons learned from military helicopter operations. "Mr. Walsh, we'd like you to consult on our emergency restart protocols. Your experience with Apache helicopters could help us save lives in civilian aviation. Jim was retired and enjoying time with his family, but the opportunity to apply his military experience to civilian safety appealed to him. What would that involve? Training commercial pilots in unconventional restart procedures, developing emergency protocols based on military aviation experience, consulting on aircraft system modifications. Jim thought about the 247 passengers on Flight 447, families who'd gone home safely because of knowledge he'd gained keeping helicopters flying in Afghanistan. When do I start? Today, Jim Walsh works as a consultant for both Boeing and the FAA, developing emergency procedures that bridge military and civilian aviation. His work on high-altitude engine restart protocols has been adopted by airlines worldwide, but he still flies commercial when he travels to see his grandchildren, usually in seat 14C, still reading maintenance manuals, still listening to engine sounds. Because once you've spent 20 years keeping aircraft flying in combat zones, you never really stop being a mechanic. You just find new ways to use those skills to keep people safe. Flight 447's dual engine failure and successful restart is now taught in aviation schools as an example of how military experience can save civilian lives. The restart procedure Jim recommended has been used successfully in 12 similar emergencies worldwide. Jim Walsh learned that expertise earned in war zones doesn't become obsolete in peacetime. It just finds new missions, new ways to serve, new lives to save. Sometimes the person who can save your life is sitting 3 rows behind you, reading a book and minding his own business. You have no idea who they are until the moment their skills become the difference between life and death. So tell us, have you ever been on a flight where you wondered about your fellow passengers? Have you ever met someone whose technical expertise, gained in military service, made them the right person in the right place at the right time? Share their story in the comments. Tell us their name. Honor the veterans whose knowledge, earned in dangerous places, continues to protect civilians every day. Because at Unsung Hero Stories, we believe that military training never really ends. It just finds new applications, new emergencies, new opportunities to save lives. Subscribe if this story moved you. We share these incredible rescue stories every week. And remember, next time you're on a plane, look around. You might be sitting next to someone whose experience could save your life if the impossible happens.